Hey guys, Lucas here with Better Coding Academy, and in today's video we're going to be doing a code review and looking at this particular project here. So I've got a React application that was submitted by someone, and inside of here we have a suburb search, we have a text box here, we've got a button over there. Let's have a look and see what it does, and let's have a look at the code as well and see how we can improve upon the code. So if I type SYD into here, you'll notice I get a lot of results starting with SYD, and it's the same obviously with anything you type in. So I can type something else and it'll give me different results. And once I click on the results, it will show here. Clicking away doesn't seem to help. Get rid of this, which we can probably have a look at later. If I click on the button here on the side, it will tell me your recent selection is Tascott, or however you pronounce that. So now if I click OK, now let's have a look here at the code. I've got the code over here, and let's just first have a look at the directory structure, and I'll explain this really quickly. So I've got git ignore. Git ignores from the Git repository. We can just Control C this and just get rid of that real quick. Do that, and then let's start it back up. Cool. Okay. So now that's running. We'll leave that running in the background. Let's go over here and let's run through the directory structure. So we've got node modules. Node modules is essentially the npm files that are generated and stored locally for the purposes of building your project. Let's not worry too much about that. That's fine. The public directory in this case represents what is shown to the user. We won't have a look at that just yet. We'll leave that as is, and we'll get back to that sometime later in the video. We've got src over here. src stands for source, S-O-U-R-C-E, and the source directory essentially represents all of the code for that project, or it should represent all of the code for a project. So that's what source does. We'll leave that and we'll get back to that really shortly. We've got package lock.json. What package lock.json tells me is essentially this person here is using npm and is not using yarn, but I might explain a little bit more on that later. We've got package.json. Now this one represents all of the dependencies, and it essentially represents, it's this kind of explanation of the project of this node.js based project or npm based project. All of its dependencies, as you can tell here. Some of the scripts, well, all the scripts that make this thing work. Some ESLint config, browsers list, dev dependencies, blah, blah, blah. The one thing that I want to point out here is that they're using React scripts. So now if I just hover over that again, you'll see that it says that React scripts is the configuration and scripts for Create React App, which tells me that this person was using Create React App. And what that tells me is that a lot of the dependencies here will be hidden, and a lot of the stuff will be bootstrapped, so that this was most likely created as a bootstrap project. But that's just something to keep in mind. I'm not really sure how that will affect this project here. But what it may mean is that sometimes the directory structure and the files inside will be representative of the Create React App directory structure, which may not be good when it gets to larger projects. But once again, we'll have to look at the code and see what it shows us. So if we go inside src here, this is my first critique here, is they've got a components directory, which is fine. It's good to have a components directory. But then they've got app.css, app.js. Now you'll notice both of these have a first letter being capital. So what that kind of tells me is that this most likely is a component. And if I click on this, you'll see that yes, it is a component, and we'll be going over more of that later. So I've got app.css, app.js, index.css, and then index.js. And index.js here, after opening it up, you can tell that this is the file that renders. So inside of React, you have to have a component that's rendered at the root level. In this case, you render the app component, and the index file is the file that does the rendering. Now that's mostly fine, except my only problem here is an issue on semantics. So semantics represents the meaning of something. So when I've got app.js, and app.js is a component, but then it's not inside the components directory, this gives me a little bit of a conflict, because when I see the components directory, I trust that all of the components for this project are stored inside of the components directory. This project might use external components, but that's a different story. So all of the components that are local to this project should be stored inside of the components directory. So that's what I expect to see here. But then I see app.js, and app.js is located outside of the components directory, and that to me is a little bit of a problem. I see this and I think, okay, well, where could other components be stored? It instantly leaves me feeling a little bit doubtful. And I know why this is the case. This is the case because when you do create React app by default, it creates an app.js and an index.js in the source directory, which in my opinion is kind of bad, but enough about that. We just need to fix this up and we need to order this in a better way. So normally what I would do is I would have the components directory, and for me personally, I like to have the components stored in a hierarchy. So I like to have components here. I like to create a folder, for example, and I'll call this one app. And then I will put app.js inside of here, app.css inside of here, and I will create a file here called index.js. And what I will do inside index.js is I will import app from /app, and then I will export default app like so. So what this allows me to do is this allows me to go into index.js here, and instead of writing import app from /app, we're going to write import app from /components/app. And that to me makes a lot more sense, because when I write /components/app, it instantly tells me that this app thing is a component, which makes sense here because we're trying to render it as a component. So that is what I would do here. And additionally, now you'll notice that these imports here inside of app.js will not work because it itself is inside of the components directory. So what I will do is I will take these and I would get rid of this, get rid of that, get rid of that. I will save and I will move these three components here inside of app. And the reason that I move them inside is because app itself is the only component here that uses button. It's the only component that uses input, and it's the only component that uses results list. So the reason that I put all three of these inside as opposed to outside is it tells anyone who's looking at this very clearly that app is the only component that depends upon these three components. Obviously, if you're using button elsewhere, which you might definitely be doing, then you should put button in another directory. And we might get into that a little bit later or in a separate video. But in this case, because all three of them are only used inside of the app directory, we can do this as the best way of putting them in a semantic position inside of our directory structure. So now that we've done that, let's have a look and make sure that our code is still compiling. So I will go back here and we're getting a few errors. Let me just Control-C this and restart it. Sometimes when you move files around the place, it will give you fake errors, but we just need to refresh and see if it fixes, and it seems to be working just fine. Cool. Now let's go back here, and I've got a few more comments here to make about app.js on the top here, and also this index.js here. We can call it index.js, but in this case, I'm a little bit hesitant to change it because React scripts here by definition looks for, by default looks for index.js, so we can keep it the way it is, that's fine. But normally I'd call it something else like init or some other name, which doesn't sound so generic like index. But for the time being, I think this is fine. What I would do here though is I would separate these imports and I will make sure they're in alphabetical order. So what I like to do is React and React DOM here are what I like to call global imports or absolute imports. I'm not sure on the exact terminology here, but basically these are imports that don't have a / at the front, and they are the ones that come straight from node modules. So when you do that, then I like to keep them in a separate kind of section on their own, and I like to make sure that they are the first ones out of all of the imports there in the block. The other thing I like to do is I like to make sure that all of these imports here, all of them are in alphabetical order within their respective sections. So this one up here, we have React followed by React-DOM, that's fine. This one here, we have /c components and then /i index, so that's fine as well. So that order is correct. And that's how I like to have them. I'm very pedantic on the exact order of these things because I find that when the order changes, it makes it really hard, especially when you have longer files, lots of files, to see where exactly your components are being imported, included, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm very, very almost OCD on these types of things, but to me, it's incredibly important. So now let's have a look at app.js, and we're going to fix the same thing about these imports up here. So first thing you'll notice is that we have two global imports here, Lodash and React, and then we have 4 relative imports. So what I would do is I would put an enter key, a carriage return there, and I would move app.css up to the top. So I do that by pressing Option down on my keyboard and then pressing the up arrow key whilst on this line. So what that will allow me to do, because I'm on a Mac, it would allow me to move app.css up to the top. I've got results list. R comes after I and after B, so that will go down to the bottom, and then B would go on top of I, but stay underneath A over here. So that is the order that I would go for this particular section here. Now, the next thing I want to talk about are these imports here for the components. So I've got button/button, import/import, results list/results list. Now, many developers, myself included, would look at this and kind of cringe. It wouldn't really look nice. If you put this in a job interview, it's not going to go down too well, simply because it's a little bit too verbose. Like, generally, if code can be shorter, more concise, and more beautifully presented, that's the better way. But obviously, developers have a lot of conflicts and a lot of opinions upon what is a better way to do things. But this personally is my way, and I still think it's how I would go ahead and do all of my components. So this is how I would do it. I would remove this, remove that, and remove this. However, when I remove those, what will happen is if you look inside terminal, I will get an error saying can't resolve button, which seems really strange at first because I've got a button directory right here. But the reason it says that is because inside of button, I've got no file called index.js. So by default, what Node will do, is it will try to look for a file called index.js inside of the directory. So if you give it a directory, it will look for index.js. So that's what you'll notice. That's what I did for app over here. I created an index.js. I imported app inside of that index.js, and then I exported it. So that when I go inside index here, when I go ./components/app, I don't have to write /app/app. I can just write ./components/app, and it will render just fine. So what I'm going to do here inside of button is I'm going to create index.js. I'm going to import button from ./button and then export default button like so. And once I do that, I'm going to do the same thing for import. Import from ./import like so. Export default import like that. I'm going to save that and do the same thing for results list. Index.js, import results list, from ./results list, export default results list like so. I'm going to save that and I'm going to check my imports again. That's fine. Now, if I go into my terminal, you'll notice it says compiling successfully. And if I go inside Chrome, you'll notice over here, it's still the exact same way. Everything seems to be fine, just as it was before. So that's how I would fix up this section here. Now let's have a look at the other parts of this code down here.